The Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale, or the ATES scale, was developed by Parks Canada. Initially, we developed the system so we could provide park visitors with a relative scale that would give them a sense of how serious the terrain is that they're going to travel through. So the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale system is similar in many ways to existing rating systems for rivers or for rock climbing, where people can get a sense ahead of time if they're up to the challenge or not. And if they're not, then they can look at a list of trips and choose trips that might be appropriate for either the conditions or for their level of training. There's 3 rating levels in the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale. Class 1 is simple terrain, Class 2 is challenging terrain, and Class 3 is complex terrain. So one thing that's unique about the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale is that it's based on landscape. So unlike an avalanche bulletin, which changes every day with the snow, we get new snow, the danger goes up. We have a long period of clear weather, the avalanche danger goes down, and it can fluctuate all the time. The terrain doesn't change, it's static. So the rating system that we use, class 1, 2, and 3, you can expect it to be the same. Simple terrain is generally pretty straightforward, generally not the kind of place where you're going to find very many big steep slopes. These are places like trails through the forest, fire roads, low-angled areas in alpine meadows, places where generally there's almost no avalanche terrain, but there might be a little bit. You might have a cut bank above a river, perhaps, or perhaps you're just going to cross the very bottom edge of a large avalanche path where an avalanche might only reach that area once in 30 years. So the chance of being caught in an avalanche in simple terrain is very low, and that's the kind of place where we encourage people who are just learning to go and get their feet underneath them and learn a little bit about the mountains and not worry too much about getting caught in avalanches. Class 2 terrain is challenging terrain, and this is the kind of place where there is lots of large slopes around, perhaps, that you can trigger an avalanche on, but the key piece is that you can get around them if you know how. So this is a place where, to travel safely, you need to be able to recognize avalanche terrain. You can't travel blindly and assume you'll miss all the avalanche terrain because there's sometimes lots of avalanche slopes around. But the key here is that you have the opportunity to avoid them. So you can choose to ski a steep slope if you want, and there's often really good skiing to be found in Class 2 terrain. But if you got out there and you decided you didn't like it or the conditions were not what you thought, then there's ways you can get around that terrain and safely make it back home at the end of the day. And so it's a place with options. Class 3 terrain is complex terrain, and that's a place, just as the word says, where it's complex. And the terrain is big and steep, and you're going to be exposed to avalanche terrain pretty significantly throughout the day. Lots of people travel in complex terrain. It's commonly traveled. A lot of the big ski trips in the mountains are just by their nature in complex terrain. Skiing happens best at, the same kind of slope angles as avalanches. So complex terrain, avalanches, and good skiing all go really well together. One thing you'll find about complex terrain is there's not usually very many options in there. So it's the kind of place, if you're going to go there, you need to be prepared to make decisions about crossing avalanche terrain. And your choices are often either to go in it or not. You don't always have a logical way to get around the slope, or perhaps you're going to travel up a very steep valley with multiple avalanche paths that overlap the trail. And so you need to be prepared to travel through those. You can't assume that you'll get around them. If you're going into complex avalanche terrain, then expect to be exposed to big avalanche paths.